Welcome to Workforce Central, the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards. Stay tuned as we explore the latest resources, thoughts, and trends in workforce development. And now, here's your host, Ron Painter.
Welcome to Workforce Central, the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards from Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Ron Painter. Doug Foresta, as always, at the control this morning. I'm happy to be joined today by Jeff Carter, who is the Executive Director of the National Council of State Directors of Adult Education. Jeff, welcome.
Ron, thank you for inviting me.
Tell me a little bit about the National Council of State Directors. Who is the membership of the organization?
The National Council of State Directors is an association of state directors of adult education, which includes adult literacy programs, adult basic education programs, English for speakers of other languages, adult secondary education, things like GED programs and high school equivalency programs, and family literacy. We have state directors of adult education in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories. We work with legislative and administration officials on issues involving adult education at the state and national levels. We also work with partners here in Washington, associations and other organizations that work on workforce and education issues. We also provide professional development services to our member states, as well as a variety of research dissemination and publishing activities that are all designed to support state adult education efforts. The key thing to remember about the state directors of adult education is that they are responsible for re-granting to programs in their states the money that flows through Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act.
You have a long history in working with adult literacy and adult education, and I look back at some of your experiences. You've really, it's replete with efforts on adult literacy, which is pretty cool. I mean, this is something that obviously, when you went to school, you are a lawyer by training, correct? Or by education, I guess.
That's right.
And so how did you get into, and we're going to talk more about adult literacy, because I have to admit, well, I don't have to, but my mom taught English. Now, you can't tell that always by me, but when I think of literacy, to me, I think of, Faulkner comes to mind, and Hemingway, and Edgar Allan Poe. And so how did you get into literacy, and how do you define adult literacy?
That's a great question. I often ask myself, how did I end up in this career? A lot of people in adult education they didn't start out when they were kids thinking, one day I want to be involved in adult education, largely because most people haven't heard of adult education. It's not the most well-known of our various educational sectors, although I would argue it's, although overlooked, it's one of our most important. I got interested, honestly, you mentioned my being a lawyer. That's actually where I got interested in this field. I was thinking at one time of going into criminal law, and I did some work when I was in law school, defending indigent clients in Boston in the district court. And I noticed that, with the exception of maybe one of my clients, all of them were undereducated, and many very low in literacy. And I began thinking about sort of the connection between education and the condition that many of these people had fallen into, and crime and public safety and all that kind of stuff. And so I guess I started getting interested in exploring the root causes of some of these problems. Feeling frustrated at once you're in court with someone, you're in a sense, you're not too late, but in a sense, you wish you could have done something earlier in that person's life to get them on the right track. Thankfully, there are a lot of people working with people who have had some problems with the law, in furthering their education. But obviously, what I was interested in seeing what we could do, what was being done to address this problem earlier on. So that's kind of how I got my start. And I was a volunteer. I tutored as a volunteer for many years, and then, one thing led to another, and I found myself in this field.
Well, you've done a number of different things in the field. As I looked at the background, Jeff, I mean, you have been, you mentioned you have been a tutor, you have been involved in the actual delivery of services. You're now a board member for the Committee for Education Funding, so you have some policy experience in there.
Yeah. Yep.
What's the like me, when I think of literacy, it's I have some vague idea. What's the biggest misconception people have about adult literacy, adult education that you've come to understand?
I think there are actually a couple of them, Ron. I think the first one is that people who have low literacy are that they can improve. I think there's a perception that if someone manages to make it to adulthood not reading and writing well or doing math well, that there's something wrong with them and that they can't learn. And unfortunately, a lot of adult learners have that self-perception as well. And that's just not true. I think the second is that these individuals are not part of the labor force. The most recent data I've seen suggests that as many as 63% of low-skilled adults are in some form of employment. So they're for the most part hardworking, tax-paying Americans, and their issue is that their lack of skills prevents them from getting to a better job. But most of them that I meet are hardworking, often working more than one job and supporting families.
Is that almost a self-reinforcing, I guess, prophecy, Jeff? If you've not done well in school, then it gets reinforced that you can't do well, and so you start to believe that.
Oh, absolutely. I remember the first time I tutored someone. This guy, terrific guy, and he really was reading at a very low level, but he was working full time. He was supporting a family, and I pointed out to him once that he had this amazing memory. He was able to memorize directions because a couple of times we got to know each other and we did some things together, and we'd be driving around, and he would remember how to get places where in situations where I would be lost. And I remember telling him that, Ron, and it's like a light bulb went off that he actually had a skill. It was revelatory and sort of sad that he had just grown up and had become an adult without anyone actually saying to him, you actually have a skill in some area. And I remember bringing that up to him later on when he was struggling over something, saying, look, as an example, look, you can learn, you are smart. That's a big hurdle for a lot of people to get over. I mean, not everyone, but certainly a lot of the adult learners that I meet have struggled with traditional schooling. And again, it doesn't mean that they are not smart and they can't learn. Often it's due to some other kind of barrier that those of us who were successful didn't encounter.
And is that one of the, I don't want to call it a task, but is that one of the first activities, Jeff, is to try and build up the individual to get them to understand they can learn?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think also, Ron, it's that plus I think addressing the actual barriers that are there. Many adult learners do have some learning challenges. So, for example, there are a lot of people, adult education classrooms with learning disabilities that they need to address. There are people who they have childcare issues, other issues associated with poverty. They move around a lot. A lot of issues, especially for low-income people, a lot of issues that low-income people have to deal with are really present barriers to being able to concentrate on learning. And I think it's a combination of helping a person understand that they can learn, but also helping them address the barriers that may be preventing them from doing so.
So, Jeff, let me, you mentioned that a large percentage of the people that your members work with are in the labor force.
That's right.
How, and that leads us to, in the legislation, the federal legislation that we're working with, which my listeners have come to understand, I call the I&O, the Innovation and Opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see adult literacy tying in with the new legislation?
Yeah. Well, I think the key is that the legislation contains a definition of what I was talking about earlier, individuals with barriers to employment. It includes various categories, such as individuals who are English language learners, have low levels of literacy, and those who are facing substantial cultural barriers. And I think, in fact, it references barriers to employment dozens of times in the legislation. And I think that that's really the key. What that says to me, and I hope to our partners in the workforce world, is that one of the key ways in which all of us who are charged with implementing WILA are going to be judged is on how well individuals with low levels of literacy and English proficiency are served. I think so. I think that's really the key piece. I think adult education is the not only the key partner in addressing those academic barriers to employment, but also in reaching a lot of these individuals to begin with. Adult education programs, especially community-based programs, are often very trusted resources in their communities, and/or they work with trusted resources in their communities. And I think reaching some of those folks who have not sought to upgrade their skills is another area where adult education programs can play a really significant role.
Let me step out for a second and remind folks you're listening to Workforce Central, the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards. I'm your host, Ron Painter. My guest today is Jeff Carter, the Executive Director for the National Council of State Directors of Adult Education. Jeff, how can programs partner, or what do you see as some of the ingredients of success where literacy has partnered with workforce?
Well, what was already happening even before this legislation was enacted, and I think in a lot of ways inspired a lot of what we saw in the legislation, were these partnerships between the workforce agencies and community colleges and adult education. One of the things that we've learned in adult education is that what doesn't work well is emulating the kind of sequential model that you see in traditional education. So if you're starting with someone who has limited skills and taking them through the academic process and getting them a GED or a high school diploma and then moving on to post-secondary education or job training, that's a long period of time, and for a lot of adult learners, that's not realistic. And not only that, but research has shown that contextualizing literacy instruction in meaningful tasks, in other words, tasks that are meaningful to the learner, such as in job skills, actually accelerates their progress. So what we've been seeing in the field for a number of years now are these integrated models where job training and basic skills instruction are combined. And there are already some great models out there in Washington State, and I'm thinking now of statewide models in Washington State and in Minnesota. I can also think from my past work of some great examples of programs. One that comes to mind that I always think about is in Savannah, Georgia. Savannah Technical College, their implementation of Georgia's Accelerating Opportunity program, which gives students the opportunity to get a GED and a certification in a specific field at the same time. And what I really liked about that model was the way Savannah Tech looked to its surrounding community and reaching out to all kinds of people, academic researchers, community leaders, local employers, to figure out what the skills were that employers needed. And from that engagement process, they added aviation mechanics and welding to their program because those are the skills that local industry required. Now, that may seem very sensible to a lot of your listeners, but what I love about that is that it was in combination with this GED program, so that immediately when people walk in the door to get their GED, they're simultaneously being trained in skills that are relevant to local employers. And that's good for the workforce, but it's also highly motivating for the learner to know that they are gaining a skill, not just a credential that's going to make them more employable.
Jeff, is there such a thing as the typical point? When does somebody realize that they need, I don't know that I want to say that they need help, but what's the point where they are motivated to seek help with their literacy or numeracy skills?
In my experience, I've seen two things. The first one is related to employment. Either they are facing a barrier to advancement in their job. Oftentimes you'll see frontline workers who are stuck in a fairly low-paying job and they can't get to the next level or access the training they would need to get to that next level without improving their basic skills. So that triggers it. Sometimes it's just that the job itself will have changed. I remember 10, 15 years ago when I first got into this field, one of the big changes was the way technology was being brought into the workplace. So people in manufacturing jobs who never had to touch a computer, all of a sudden computers were plunked down their desks and they were told to do all the things they used to do verbally or by phone, all of a sudden they were doing over email. So that changed the skill set needed for that particular job. But I want to tell you the other big motivating factor, and I think in my experience this is one of the biggest ones, and it's not unrelated, but oftentimes people, parents, come in because they are concerned, they don't want their children to suffer through the academic challenges that they did, and they want to be able to help their children become better learners, and that often ends up being the tipping point for people to seek help.
That's awesome. I was just reading a story the other day from one of the local workforce boards where a parent, in order to encourage his daughter to do better in school, they started studying together, and both of them point to that as highly motivating for them to both achieve more than they normally would. Jeff, I want to ask you mentioned technology, and of course it is everywhere in our lives today. I know when you and I attend meetings, we can look around the table and there's Surfaces and iPads and smartphones all over the place. How is technology changing what your members do or how they approach their work?
It's kind of a revolution in this respect. For the first time ever, students are coming to class with the technology in their pockets. 15 years ago, what we talked about was, and I actually worked on projects related to this, we talked about how we're going to bring more computers into the classroom. And I remember working with people on, technology plans to build these computer labs that people in their community could access. Now what we're talking about is how do we leverage the technology that people are coming into the classrooms with. I'm really surprised, maybe I shouldn't be, but I have been surprised, even people with relatively low incomes, how many of them have smartphones, for example. And I think as the price point, the price comes down on laptops, tablets, and phones, you're just going to see an increase in this. And adult learners know that this is the tools that they need to be able to, when they're talking about improving their literacy, they know that these are the tools that they will be practicing that literacy on. So that's very, very important. And we're still, I think, really at the beginnings of figuring out how to leverage that.
I was just going to ask that, Jeff. I was going to follow up and say, so if the student has technology at their fingertips, how prepared are we, and I refer to the collective we in the workforce development system. How prepared do you think we are for this explosion in access?
I think that we still have a long way to go. I think, for example, we are still trying to figure out what kind of instructional app works best on, say, a smartphone. Is it to practice skills? Is it work better for people who are at lower levels, higher levels, English language learners? How is it different to build an app for these different kinds of needs? I mean, we're still trying to figure that out. There's a really interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with the X Prize. There's an interesting X Prize competition going on right now that is where teams of developers and folks from adult education are working on prototype apps for mobile devices to try to address some of those questions. So we're getting there, and there are certainly a lot more programs around the country that are expanding into digital learning than ever before. One of my favorite examples is up in Philadelphia, actually, where they have taken sort of a traditional adult education system in Philadelphia and moved a lot of their work, their classes online, that people can not only work on at home, but also they can come into these centers that they've set up and get help when they need it. And I think that's really going to be the key. You know, the technology is a great way to deliver instruction, Ron, but it's not going to remove the need for personalized attention that a lot of adult learners need. The blended models of instruction where folks are doing some independent learning, but also they have access to a teacher or peers who can help them when they get stuck. I think this is where we're headed. But like I said, while there are some promising practices out there, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, we know from lots of research in youth programming that human touch, that human motivator is really critical. And I hear you say the same thing. Who is working with that population is really critical.
Yeah.
I know that you're originally from Boston, so I've avoided
That's right.
asking you about the upcoming Red Sox season. So we'll do away with one potentially touchy subject.
I appreciate that very much. And also, since we're having this conversation in February, thank you also for not bringing up the Bruins. An equally sore spot for me right now.
Well, I'll give you a softer question then. It probably would help if we had more federal support for literacy. Would I be safe in saying that we're headed into a tough budget year?
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff in the legislation that we were talking about. WIOA has, I think, is the blueprint for moving us forward, especially in terms of the integration of workforce and adult education. But we can't fool ourselves into thinking we can implement all these new changes while for the last decade, we've been gradually decreasing the amount of federal support for adult education programs. You know, Ron, we're only serving with federal dollars about 1.6 million people out of an estimated need of about 30 million. And no amount of innovation alone is going to move that needle too much, although there are certainly some exciting areas where we can think about the use of technology, for example, to scale. And new investments are definitely going to be needed. And I would say not only from the public sector, but from the private sector as well, if we're going to seriously address this problem. So you're right. It's an exciting time to be working in this field, but we are going to need some more resources if we're going to be successful under this new legislation.
Jeff, that's a huge number. 30 million people in the labor force struggling with literacy and numeracy, and that has to impact a business's bottom line.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and remember, Ron, it's not, in the world economy, it makes us less competitive. One of the things that I think is is important. So the statistics I mentioned, and it's actually about 36 million adults with less than basic literacy, and nearly 1 in 3 with less than basic math skills. That's significantly behind a lot of other countries around the world that we're competing with. So, yeah, it's an issue that addresses people on a very personal level. I'm very motivated by the personal stories that I hear from people who are working so hard in adult education programs, and by the teachers and the administrators and my folks, the state directors. They're all doing a terrific job. So and that's my primary motivation. But this is also a serious economic issue for our country that we need to collectively solve.
And Jeff, I know I speak for many people saying your work here in D.C., we appreciate that you are a significant and respected policy voice here for literacy. As we close, I want to ask you one question. So, closing thoughts on what you think are maybe, and there's no magic to the number, but the 1, 2, 3 important things for a workforce director to keep in mind when it comes to the literacy challenges.
I think I touched on this earlier. I think that understanding that many of these adults have had very poor experiences in traditional educational settings, but they're not stupid. They do have experience and they can learn, but many of them may be very unsure of their ability to learn. So I think sort of understanding that is really important. And then secondly, that there are resources, adult education programs in their communities that they can partner with to help. And I think that is going to be very, very, that's a key piece of this legislation, is the emphasis on local workforce boards working with their partners in adult education to address those needs. So I think that's really are the keys.
Jeff, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I've learned some things, which is always good for me. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you again for having me.
If somebody wants to learn more about the work of the National Council, or how can they go about doing that?
Well, I think the best way probably would be to visit our website, which is ncsdae.org.
Okay, say that one more time.
Sure, it's our acronym. So it's the National Council for the State Directors of Adult Education. So ncsdae.org. Okay,
and they can find a directory of who in their state, or how to contact somebody in their state.
That's absolutely right, and also my contact information is up there. So if anyone has any questions, just go to About Us and Staff, and you can shoot me an email.
All right. Again, thanks, Jeff. You've been listening to Workforce Central, the official podcast of the National Association of Workforce Boards. I've been your host, Ron Painter. Doug Forrest at the controls. Hopefully you will join us again. Thank you.